Good. So I'm just going to draw a card for our session. It's always nice to start with a card. This, of course, just relates to your life and maybe what you need to know or what you need to look at or what's happening out there. And the card here is Demeter. Demeter is the goddess of agriculture and abundance on one hand. So she's about growth, and that relates to a very physical level. So it's our basic needs being taken care of, but she also relates to what's beyond the basic needs, the abundance physically, but also then the richness of the inner journey. And in that regard, she's very spiritual, very much about undertaking a path of initiation. She's the kind of mother figure who takes care of the initiate as he or she undertakes this journey of initiation. And we'll talk a little bit more about Demeter later because of the mysteries, the Eleusinian and Samothracian mysteries, which were very important in the ancient world. So she's that initiator, she's that protector of the initiate. And of course, initiation relates to not being once born, not being just a child who's been born into this world and kind of lives and just kind of exists unconsciously through life. But the initiate is that person who takes the step to cultivate that inner light, that inner spiritual being, in order to become twice born, and reborn into a truer self, as opposed to staying, once born, in which we remain at the mercy of our conditioning and at the mercy of the life that has been imposed upon us. So there's a lot to her, and of course we'll talk more about her when we talk about the mysteries. These visualizations are very important because they are a way of creating this relationship with the archetypes. It's an intuitive relationship, of course, so it's through hypnosis, through meditation, through the teacher plants, through other activities like chanting or dancing that we enter the realm of these archetypes. And one of the simplest ways, and one of the ways that I really suggest you develop in your life, is to do this through the meditation, through the visualization, to create the sensitivity and the intuitive openness to these divinities and archetypes. So we'll start talking today a little bit about the history of especially the ancient Greek religion, and of course throughout the course we'll then go deeper into the individual gods and goddesses. One of the main reasons I developed these cards was exactly because it gets very confusing. It's a lot of difficult names to understand, it's a lot of difficult concepts to understand, it's complicated family trees. So of course, when you've got this card in front of you with a picture with the symbols, you can start to really understand and unpack these gods and goddesses better. For example, with Zeus, he's the king of the universe, he's the king of the gods, he sits on a throne, and his totem animal is the eagle. And he is also the god of thunder and all of the different things that thunder represents. And then here, of course, he holds the staff of Nike, of victory, which represents his victory over the various battles that he had to wage in becoming king, but also that mastery over his reality, over his world. So he becomes this paragon, this representative of that energy of authority and power. So when I talk about Zeus, and Zeus represents authority, that's all very abstract. But when we can relate it to a card and a picture and symbols, it becomes very real. So first of all, I don't want you to feel daunted by the idea of all of these gods and goddesses and all of these different meanings and frequencies and energies. Through the cards, we will unpack this and we will make it alive. It's obviously always through pictures that things are most alive. But we do need to look at some of the theory. We need to talk through some of the different aspects, of course, of these. So the cards become the mnemonic tool, the memory prompter that help you develop this relationship with the gods and the goddesses. And just before I go into the history side, just a very important point that I think is really worth stressing in the beginning of this session is that we get to know the gods and the goddesses as characters, not as dry concepts. So as we start to meditate on them, as we perhaps make offerings or prayers, we then start to develop a relationship. As we start to perceive them in our lives, like, oh, I'm having trouble with transport on whatever level. I'm always running late. That's Hermes, Mercury, that's speaking to me or showing a blockage. Or, my relationship with my child isn't good at this time. That's either Poseidon or Demeter coming in. And, and then from there we can start to fine tune and understand different messages that are coming our way. So the cards themselves, when you draw it, it gives a message, but the events in life, the things that happen also bring us messages and show us the way. So our purpose here on this planet, in this world, of course, is to learn and to grow. And we're not just kind of dumped here on this rock and we've got to figure it out for ourselves. That's why we've got the archetypes, the gods and the goddesses. They are generously working with us in order to help us evolve and to make, the world a better place, I believe. And that's of course why people in the ancient times built the temples and the sanctuaries. It was a means to interact in a more focused and powerful way with these other dimensions. And temples weren't just built to be pretty or to house treasures. They were actually built on sacred sites, geographical points that held inherent energy and power. And when those temples were built there, when those treasures were put there, that energy was empowered and augmented, and it made those sanctuaries even more powerful. So it kind of became this relationship between nature, natural forces, and the humans. So it became the symbiotic growth and the symbiotic relationship. And that said, whatever we invest energetically into these energies, we get back, because we are kind of handing over our limited ego perspective and perception, and we're making space for something bigger to come in. We're saying, I don't necessarily only trust my ego, I'm also going to open up to the divine. I'm going to open up to something bigger. So this is a relationship that we're building. This is an alliance that we're building. So when we work on building an alliance with these divinities, we do so by investing energy. We do so by making them real in our lives. And of course, at some point, we all remember our monotheistic upbringing, which of course said, thou shalt not make any graven images, and thou shalt not be idolatrous. And, one could say, oh, is this a course about becoming idolatrous? And in a way it is, and in a way it isn't, because we're not worshipping an idol that's a statue. We are creating sacredness. It could be through a statue, it could be through an altar, it could be through a place that we go to. We're creating sacredness, a place of greater connection, where we can, sort of really energize ourselves, and where we can learn and where we can grow. But of course, being physical beings with a physical body, our unconscious mind relates better to something that's physical. It feels more tangible, it feels more real, and therefore it feels more powerful. And therefore we can cultivate and develop deeper beliefs as a result. So that's why, that's why ritual is so important. That's why sacred space, an altar, is so important. It's actually for a physical space to hold and emanate an energy. And that's an energy that we can feed, but it's also an energy that we can be fed by. So again, this is very much about relationship with so-called external archetypes, relationship with our internal archetypes and our inner being. And what we find as we work more with the archetypes, and this is kind of a general rule, it might shift and change a little bit according to each individual, but generally speaking, we've got one main archetype that is inherently who we are, and then we've got other archetypes. Maybe when it comes to our relationships, we slip into one archetype, and when it comes to work, we slip into another role. And the importance here is to learn to maybe see what the different archetypes are, to understand ourselves, and also to see the ways in which in some areas we might play out the negative face of an archetype or the positive face only. And we can also then learn how to balance those, to sort of observe the ways in which we are being negative and the ways in which we are playing out a negative side of a god or a goddess, because the gods and the goddesses do have negative sides. And that, I would say, relates more to a lower frequency level and expression. When we're very much in our own personality, when we're very much in our own stuff, these archetypes are still there, but they're playing out on a lower frequency. As we start to develop our self-awareness, as we start to develop, let's say, a purer relationship with these archetypes, we then start to enter a higher frequency expression of these archetypes. So that's also where the myths come in. A very important thing to remember about basically all ancient religions, apart from Judaism and Christianity, and this includes Hinduism, is that they didn't have like a Bible or the one book that lays out all the rules and is the official version of the story. The myths had many different versions, many different interpretations. In different eras, the myths changed and evolved into something else. So sometimes we see Zeus, for example, fooling around and seducing every nymph that crosses his path. And that might then be like a lower expression of what the Zeus energy could be. The higher expression would be that he's a god of fertility. He brings rain, he brings thunder and lightning, which brings this light, which seeds this light into the world. But then on a very much a lower frequency, a very much human ego expression, he is this philanderer and this seducer. So, sometimes people get put off by some of the characteristics of these gods and goddesses. And I would say that, people are only getting put off, number one, by a low frequency expression, but number two, maybe they're being triggered because that is showing something in themselves. They're being triggered by the very characteristics or traits that either they have and judge, or that they reject in themselves. They haven't seen yet. And the process of personal growth then becomes about learning to see these characteristics and trait. So again, that becomes part of this path of self-actualization. So one of the areas that we're going to be working with in terms of these archetypes is looking at the myths, but then also looking at what the purer archetypal expression is. And even within ancient Greece, you had, very much the folk stories and tales, and then you had the philosophers' interpretations. And the way in which Plato, for example, spoke about the gods and goddesses is very different to the way that that maybe the uneducated people would have seen these gods and goddesses. And those different levels have their very valid functions. And that kind of speaks to the broadness and depth of these archetypes. They can be read on so many different levels. So we will be reading them and looking at them on different levels in order to understand better, to get a full picture. And inevitably in our lives, we will have played out some of the negatives, we will have played out some of the positives. Maybe we don't even know yet what our principal archetype is, but it's by looking at what our negatives are, at what our positives are, that we can start to unravel the story of ourselves. And then from there, sort of learn to develop the characteristics that take us to the higher frequency expression of these archetypes. So what I'm trying to say is we're not bound by the stories. We're not bound by the myths. The myths give indications, the symbolic animals and other symbols also give insight into what these gods and goddesses are. Beyond that, as you develop your relationship, your understanding, as you attune to that energy of the archetype, then you will better understand and you will better see how that archetype fits into your life. And I guess at this point it's also worthwhile repeating that fundamental saying or principle of the ancient Greeks, which was written above the door of the Temple of Delphi, which was the sanctuary of Apollo and Dionysius, and that principle is know thyself. And I think that is the whole Greek religion kind of condensed down into two words: know thyself, because that is what this journey is about. We can know ourselves through the inner journey. We can have all of this information outside, all of this sense of the gods and worshiping the gods or rejecting the gods in the outside world. But it's actually how all of that affects us, how that allows us to develop, that allows us to grow, that we then really understand that it's in knowing myself that I know God. It's in knowing myself inwardly that I know the outer world. It's in knowing my mechanisms of either openness to certain things or rejection of certain things, resistance. It's by knowing my inner mechanisms that I can understand why my relationships look the way they do, why my career is blocked or why it's flowing. It's by knowing the inner prompting, which has a divine aspect, that we can then look at, that we can then understand what is happening on an external level. And of course, that takes us back to that principle of as above, so below. The macrocosm is reflected in the microcosm. The bigger world, the bigger universe happens as a result of our inner experience, as our manifestation. Of course, the world out there is vast and enormous, but it's through our filters and it's through our energy that we kind of choose and go into specifics. So if you imagine there's like this vast possibility of all different types of human experiences, through our conditioning, we have a very limited experience. That doesn't mean that the rest doesn't exist. It's just that within our experience, that's how we go forward and that's how we live. So obviously, if we have a very limited experience, we're going to have a very limited life. And that is, of course, where spirituality and self-development comes in, is we learn to open more. We learn to expand our horizons so that we can become better people and sort of live more fulfilled lives and channel the divine better in our physical world. Of course, when we're disincarnated, we're kind of everything all at once. When we come into this world, we come in specifically to experience a limited perspective of the world. But that doesn't mean we're doomed to that limited perspective. The more we can awaken, the more we can gain self-awareness, the kind of the more we evolve on a soul or on a spiritual level. And that takes us into sort of another area of metaphysics. But I'm just kind of reinforcing this to say that, the ancient pagan ways are not divorced from, modern experience. We're not doing this work or this course as a revival or as a history lesson. It's very much a living spirituality, and it's a spirituality that doesn't contradict other spiritualities. It's the spirituality of living in this physical world, understanding the forces, the natural forces of this physical world, which undeniably we have to interact with on some level. There are certain rules of this reality. We can choose to ignore them or we can choose to change them, but there are still certain rules that we need to start with. And again, this archetypal understanding gives us the inroads into this deeper understanding.